Good evening. Good evening. My name is Paul Holdengraber. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library. It's a great pleasure to have you here. My goal here at the library, as you know, is to make the lions roar, to make a heavy institution levitate, if possible.
Hello everyone. Today is another one of those more personal episodes with someone I've known a long time, a man named Paul Holdengraber. I first met him when I was a student in New York City. In some strange way, we ended up in similar publishing circles and became friends, and this was around the same time that he was becoming something of a famous man in this literary world of New York City, and the events he was building were at the New York Public Library in the Stephen Schwarzman building. These two big lions out front, a couple of blocks from Grand Central on 42nd Street. If you've been to Bryant Park, it's that giant building framing the park. And when you go inside and up 2 floors, up these big staircases, you come to the Rose Reading Room. This big sort of almost church-like space with these murals of clouds on the ceilings and circular chandeliers, and it might sound kind of kitschy, but it feels very luxurious. It makes you feel like you're part of something special sitting there all day studying, which I did a lot. And at the end of those days, quite often, it would be a really sweet reward to walk out of that gorgeous, cavernous reading room, down a few flights of stairs, and into another very spectacular space that's part of this huge New York Public Library building called the Celeste Bartos Forum, because that was where Paul, as the director of public programming, would hold his events. I'd hear him talk with Rebecca Solnit or Jhumpa Lahiri, Jay-Z, Mike Tyson, Christopher Hitchens, Pete Townsend, Zadie Smith, Adam Phillips, who Paul really loves and mentions a lot in this conversation, Marina Abramovich, Margaret Atwood, Bill Clinton, and John Hope Franklin. It just went on and on. There was so many people at these events. But the events themselves were very special. It wasn't just another talk. It was a real event. There was something about being in that room, being in that landscape of conversation that was created. So that's why I reached out to him to talk, because he does create landscapes of conversation. At least I've experienced him doing that many times. And as I've started to imagine conversations as landscapes and what a power it is to have them and be changed by them and be in them, I've started to wonder, what is a conversation? How does this happen? And should we even think about it too much? So Paul is definitely a sort of curator or conductor of conversations. And I talked to him a little bit about how that came to be in his own life and what it means for him. Paul's also just a really interesting conversation partner in his own right, probably the only person in the world to ever get a recommendation letter from Foucault. Paul calls himself a quotomaniac by profession. He likes to say he's a digressor, and he does often digress and steer away from his own biography, but he does talk of his parents a lot. He obviously loves them very deeply, and they shaped him in all sorts of ways, not least by having escaped the Nazis the last minute, sort of, in 1938, fleeing Vienna, and then only meeting and finding one another in Haiti. Here we talk a bit about what conversation means, the power of it, the art of it, what it does to us, Paul's own path, some of the challenges he's had to face or is facing now, the landscapes, and I just want to thank Paul for all the conversations he's gifted over these years, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. I hope you also look at some of Paul's other conversations, which I'll be sure to put in the show notes. Also hope you're doing well wherever you are and whatever landscapes you're moving through.
There's always been a quest for truth, and nobody knows what it is. I think there was some sort of a ballot taken where the pulse felt among philosophers, 2,000 worldwide. What is truth? And they had no real answer. Nobody can explain and declare what truth actually is. We do not know.
And I keep thinking that is a real blessing.
That's the first time I hear such a thing, yes. I do agree. Sometimes things do not need to be fully explained. We cannot explain it. A very good question most of the time is better than a very good answer.
We were trying to figure out how we had met, and it was somehow through Berlin.
It was so lovely to hear from you. I must say it sort of made my heart beat a bit stronger. I was really very, very pleased. I may or may not have told you that I wanted to teach a class once on digression. And I really only had the first line of the class. The class was, this is a class on digression. But before I begin, anyway, anyway,
That's a good one.
It's a good one. This was first, and it's true. The very first year I taught at Williams College 100 years ago, when I was a pretend scholar, I had this idea already back then that it really would be interesting to teach a class on digression. And I'm sure already then I knew the wonderful line of Lawrence Stern, who said that digression is the sunshine of narrative, which was something that stayed in my mind forever. And about 15 years ago, Princeton, where I got my graduate degree 100 years ago, had been asking me again and again if I would come and give a talk in the humanities departments. They invite people usually to show them, this is kind of fitting for your conversation, to show that people who have studied literature, not neuroscience, but literature and the humanities, may have a future. And they believe probably that I had a future. They had invited the year before David Remnick, who also had a future, obviously.
What year are we talking about now?
About 15 years, about 15 years ago, maybe only 10 years ago.
Okay.
Probably only 10
I think
years.
You already had a pretty clear future.
I had a future, and now we can talk about my future, which is a little more of an issue. But I kept saying to Princeton, I don't give talks. I don't give talks. I talk, but I don't give talks.
There is a big difference. Yeah.
Big difference. And I said, you know what? And I said, you know what I like doing? I like talking to people as I'm talking.
Conversation is a little different than giving a talk. Or giving a talk maybe, but a lecture and all this is very
lecture
strange.
is not my
not
thing
your word
at all.
No,
also because I wouldn't know how to structure it. And I kept saying no every year. And then finally I thought, okay, they really want me, and it's very lovely to be desired. And I said, why don't I interview someone? Or why doesn't somebody interview me? Which is something that people had kept saying. And Adam Phillips, a psychoanalyst I much admire, he kept saying,
I saw you talk to him in New York quite a few times.
I'm sure.
Great talks.
We've done it a few times. And Adam who was
kissing, tickling, and being bored. Is that the book?
And being bored, and he has a great line in the Paris Review. I quote it because I did a Paris Review interview with him. The only Paris Review interview in the 75 years of the Paris Review that has a psychoanalyst as a subject of an interview. I think you would enjoy it, by the way. And if you can't find it, let me know. I know it's behind paywalls, but I can get it to you. And he says that digression is secular revelation, which is beautiful.
Digression is secular revelation.
It's very interesting.
It's very, it's a version of sunlight, of the
it is.
Sunlight of narrative, isn't it?
Except, but and so I said, I have an idea. Why don't we have, because Adam kept saying, next time I'm interviewing you, which of course I've never let happen, because my goodness, to be interviewed by a psychoanalyst, I can think about something. It might be more pleasurable. But at any rate, I haven't yet submitted myself. Maybe I will before I die.
Oh, I thought we were leading up to it happened, and I was going to say, how did I miss this? But okay.
I said to Princeton, to the head of the complete department, I said, I have an idea. Why don't we ask my advisor, Victor Brombert, to interview me? Now, Victor at that point was 90. Day before yesterday, he turned 100.
Oh, wow. Happy birthday to him.
He's a wonderful, wonderful man.
This was your advisor at Princeton?
Brombert. He wrote the most beautiful books on French literature, on the idea of the prison in literature. He's just written a book at the age of 100 called Musings on Mortality, and another book called The Pensive Citadel, which just came out. I mean, imagine that. And he does remind me of
good.
my
I like
father
that.
in the sense that my father at age 97, when people would ask him when he would retire, he said, "I'm too old to retire." But at any rate,
Paul, let's start there, actually. Let's start where I am, which is
okay,
close to where your father has been, is still. And that, guess where I am right now? Leuven.
Vienna.
No.
No,
Belgium.
no.
Yes, I'm in Leuven. I think I say it wrong because
In
there's
Louvain, in
the
Leuven,
Leuvan. I never know how to say it right.
at the Flemish,
Yes, the Flemish Leuven.
What are
Yeah.
you doing there?
I'm here visiting a friend. She's at the law school. She has a like a visiting thing that just happens to be only this time that I could come see her. So it's a little bit interesting that that's where I
Wow.
am. Yeah, that's
Would
where I
you,
am
would
right
you
now in a hotel room. And I just realized, isn't this kind of the area that your parents eventually came back to? And you too, maybe as a teenager or as a boy, or
you remember things well? Yes. So my
okay,
parents, my parents left Vienna just in time. My father left the day before the last day you could leave Vienna in June 1938.
whoa.
My parents met in Haiti. My
So your dad fled to Haiti, right?
father
And your mom,
fled, and my
or
mother separately.
separately,
My
but both
father,
from
both
Austria?
from Vienna, both met in Haiti. There were 137 Jewish families in Haiti. They met there. They were married in Haiti. They remained married until they both died. At the age my mother was 89, my father was 97. They were married for 71 years.
It's amazing. I remember you visiting them often
Yeah,
in
a
Belgium, I
lot.
think, around here, but I didn't have
Very,
an
very,
image of it
very
then.
much. I went the year I went to undergraduate school when I studied philosophy and law. I went to Louvain-la-Neuve. They had
Which
just
is
separated
that's the
line.
French one. That's like an
That's a
hour
French.
from here, right? Or
It's an
something.
hour from
Okay.
here. They separated the library in two in a very Belgian way. Volume 1, 3, 5, and 7 was in one university, 2, 4, 6, and 8 in another. They separated
How's
the
that?
orchestra with the Flemish-speaking violinist and the French-speaking violinist.
Oh, wow.
Crazy
Amazing you
country.
say that because we were just at the law faculty and there's those
Yeah,
double staircases.
yeah.
And there are kind of two staircases right beside each other. And my friend asked why was it built like this? And it was like, oh, because the French students and the Flemish students didn't want to interact, so they had to have separate staircases or something.
It's amazing you should say that. When I visited Vienna with my father, he showed me two staircases going to the medical school, and the Jews were asked to take a different staircase. It wasn't built for that purpose. And then the Nazis already at that point wanted to go up the staircases that they had designated for the Jews, and there were huge fistfights.
Whoa.
Father spoke to me about that. That's a whole other story. They went from Vienna to Mexico, and then, since you were mentioning this, for many reasons, my father became rather restless and decided he wanted his children to get a European education. And so very much wandering Jew kind of way, we went from country to country, including back to Vienna, where my mother started to speak German with a French accent. We went to Düsseldorf and to Zurich and to Lucerne, and then finally to Belgium, Brussels. Why Brussels? My father would have told you because Brussels was central. I'm not sure central to what, but it was central. And so we lived in Belgium, which is not the place where my mother was happy, not the place where I would have really wanted to grow up. Though, interestingly enough, I think a lot about Brussels now. It comes back in my mind. And I was invited by a Pan-African literary festival to come to Brussels last year to give a keynote speech, which I did do. So I'm not consistent.
So you do speak. You do give speeches.
I do give speeches on the notion of what it means to return.
Oh,
And
that's
I remember,
quite powerful.
yeah, I remember telling a friend of mine that I would do this, and he said, don't forget what Bob Dylan said about going back. You can always go back, but you always can come back, but you can't come back all the way. And so I mentioned all of that and spoke in a panel. I was nearly the only white person among all those people for whom the idea of home, of course, was much more complicated than for me. They were from the Congo and from Senegal and from all kinds of different places. At any rate, yes, I did grow up, insofar that I grew up. I did grow up in Brussels.
It feels interesting that I came back here to talk to you because I associate Belgium with you, but only in the past few years I've had some memories or images of it, and so it feels a little bit richer. But for some reason, I seem to remember you moved around a lot even once you were here, didn't you? Or is it more like I'm thinking of you reading lots of books? Or
no,
I don't know.
Well, reading books is a way of moving around, but it wasn't that. You're absolutely right. I studied in Louvain, and then I went, after I studied philosophy there, I went to Paris. So I studied in Paris, and in the real heyday of the waning of French intellectual, philosophical greatness in some way, right?
So right after all the big philosophers.
Well, I studied Foucault, and I studied with Holdengraber.
You studied with Foucault? I didn't know that.
Yeah, Foucault wrote to me my letter of recommendation for Princeton.
What? Wow. I mean, I knew you knew Levy and all those people, but
it was 2 lines long.
What did it say?
It said something like, the premises of Holdengräber's work on European nihilism seems to me well-founded. Michel Foucault.
Wow, that's like a blurb you should be using.
Yeah, it's like a blurb. I don't know where the letter is, but I am positive.
That's incredible, Paul. Wow.
Into Princeton, the professors were impressed not by me, but by the letter I got.
Yeah, that he wrote. I mean, that's probably very unusual.
Very unusual.
I feel like, okay, maybe this is wrong, but I have this image of you as like a teenage boy reading a lot and also moving around a lot. Didn't you walk a lot? Or maybe we used to talk about walking a lot, or driving, or hitchhiking.
No, you're absolutely
you had this kind of restlessness too, right? You said your dad was restless.
Very much, and still now. So my father believed, and I'll use the word he used, my father believed that it was immoral for a boy to travel any other way than hitchhiking.
Oh, your dad said that.
Before he reached the age of 21. So, and my mother didn't agree with my father.
Where did this come from? This was just his big belief.
From his own past, from thinking, and I owe my father my ability to talk.
That's a big thing.
Because I was able to talk to anyone.
I just lost your sound right when you said you could talk. There you go.
A
little joke from your dad there.
I know. I think he believed very much that you need to be able to talk to anybody, and hitchhiking is a wonderful way of inventing your life. You tell all kinds of stories, some true, some less true. And so I hitchhiked, and I actually went to Vienna with my father. I went hitchhiking, he went by train, and I was there earlier than he was because I went on these autobahns in Germany where people used to drive 200 kilometers an hour, and picked him up picked him up at the train station. And he thought I had been on the train, and that I just ran out to greet him.
That's beautiful. So is that really how you learned how to talk? Was that like a lesson in how to converse with anyone?
This is the owl of Minerva taking its flight at dusk. It's me it's me making up a story about how I learned. I have these packaged.
It does force one. Yeah.
It's a good one. There's probably some truth to that, but I did, and it's amazing the memory you have. Really amazing, because what I did when I was 14 or 15 years old is I walked from the Lac de Constance to the Lac Le Mans in Switzerland by myself, having read Rainer Maria Rilke. Read the Letters to a Young Poet. I took it to heart, and I imagined that that one had to be alone. And I took a backpack, and for 3 weeks, I walked from one part of Switzerland to the other, 300 and some kilometers on my own, sleeping in huts one night and in tents another night. And so I did lead, now having children, I realized to what extent I led a somewhat friend-less solitary life. My friends being books and music, and really I was completely devoid of any understanding, knowledge, or any contact with popular culture. I mean, my wife Barbara is always amazed that I just know nothing. I have a wonderful T-shirt with a cover of an album by Joy Division that somebody gave me. And I mean, I just didn't even know it was that.
There's always been something of the solitary. I actually wanted to ask you about this next when you were talking before, because you studied philosophy. I studied philosophy. I understand what it is to get lost in books and be solitary and walk. I think that's why I remember your stories, because they were similar to mine. And it's a really solitary space, but yet you're also very voracious, gregarious, and so on in your public life with conversations. And I could never have hitchhiked across anywhere at that age when I was in that philosophy bubble. So how did these two worlds come together?
I think to some extent, perhaps I was less in a bubble than you.
Okay.
Maybe my bubble had little holes. So I always also loved the contact with people, though I don't think I had very many deep friends. And I think friendship perhaps is something that I've developed later in life. I feel like now I have some friends, though I would say that the notion of friendship is tremendously important to me. I don't think I've been particularly good at it.
Why not?
But I do create the illusion of friendship and proximity through these conversations.
Well, I feel like you can go very deep with people. But yeah, why do you think you're not a good friend? Is it that
I think I don't maintain contact enough. I mean, it's really a pleasure to speak to you now, but it's so odd that if we had something in common, why didn't I stay in touch with you?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we both didn't really. I think
No,
we
I
both
know. I
moved
mean, I'm
different ways.
I'm not saying, why didn't you stay in touch with me? No, I'm not, this is not the but I'm illustrating it because I'm talking to you, but I would say this happens often.
I feel it about you. There's something about you that goes very deep, but also it's not that you turn away, but I don't know. I think I try to put it back into the books, right? Where you can go really deep in the books because you can close the book at the end or something, or
that's a good idea, good image.
Yeah, there's something about not having to maintain that depth in a consistent way that allows one to go deep. It's hard to maintain that stuff over time and space. I remember from your time in New York, I mean, that takes a lot of energy, and it gets, people just assume it will happen. It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy space to create, right? So I don't know, maybe that's part of it too, that you just, energy-wise, it's very hard to, once people know you can go there, they think you should just always be there in that deep space. Maybe that's
so interesting. It reminds me of what happens when I'm quiet in places and people wonder if I'm okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a very peculiar kind of reaction, but I understand it. And it probably does have something to do with the notion that a conversation for me is performative. Yeah. And it isn't, I'm not quiet. I bring my body. I'm very present. I'm present. I try to maintain the space also in terms of what you mentioned earlier, the silences. I try not to fill them at all. I don't mind the discomfort, But I think like an actor who might be on stage, they might be off stage. And so I think there's something of that happens to me. And, without using you as my psychoanalyst at this moment, there probably is in me a fear of intimacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say that earlier, but I thought if it's true, you probably wouldn't want to hear it.
Well, now that I've said it, I heard it, and I've heard you.
It's better that you said it.
Yeah, so I think there's something about that. And when I brought up Adam, I'm sure he'd have 100 things to say about that. But there is something this week I'm speaking with Werner Herzog again on Saturday.
Is it like the 20th time or what? I think you met him too when I met you about 20 years ago.
About the 20th time, and I understand that we have an accent that is not utterly dissimilar. So the subject he chose is the future of truth, whatever that might mean, which is kind of fascinating.
You always have interesting subjects. What was the one 20th century something?
Was the 20th century mistake, which was published. It was
really?
You can look it up. It's actually his favorite interview.
Oh, great!
It was published by Michael Ondaatje in Brick magazine. Brick like a brick.
Yep.
You can find it. It's online. I think you'd enjoy it because he has fabulous things to say there. Really interesting. But one thing you wanted to bring up in your preliminary comments was what happens in conversation, and what is it that conversation reveals. And I've come, as you know, I'm a quotomaniac by profession, and there's a line that I adore, Andrea, which is a line from Tristan Tzara, one of the founders of Dadaism, and he says that thought is made in the mouth. And I love that. It's probably not true completely because it's made in many other places, but it is also made, if you think of it in a philosophically Greek context of the dialogues and the whole notion of what happens, or if you think of it with Bakhtin in mind and the dialogical imagination, and you think of le va-et-vient, the coming, the exchange. I think something happens when we talk to each other. Human beings are creatures who talk to each other.
Yeah, I think I would say that makes sense. If you understand talk as an embodied act, it's movement for me. That's why I brought up the stuff about walking, and even with Herzog, the way he creates worlds or spaces or landscapes, this physical, mental, emotional kind of way that we move. For me, that's what thinking is. And I guess speaking, like language and conversing, is a form of movement through a space, isn't it? I mean, do you think about that when you're
very much
doing your conversations, that
very
you're actually
much
in a landscape? Yeah.
I'm writing this down because I love it. And one of the titles of a conversation I had with Werner, you can find all of these things online, uses the word landscape.
Oh, great. I have to hear that one.
Title, you'll find it.
But I think you were already talking about that even in New York with him, because
we were. And in a way, I'm still talking about it.
It's similar.
I haven't progressed. In many ways.
Well, it's just that, these things change and it gets deeper. Yeah, and there's more to talk about.
I think so. And I think body language matters to me enormously. And so, for instance, yesterday I was speaking to the man who's organizing the conversation with Werner, and he works for the Thomas Mann House. Thomas Mann lived in Los Angeles, in the Pacific Palisades. Do you ever come out here?
I do sometimes. Yeah, I haven't been there in a while. But funny you just bring that up, because I just met I just met this person. I don't know him so well, but he was just saying he's going there for the Thomas Mann House now has fellowships apparently, or something.
Who is that?
I can't remember his name. It was at a conference thing, and he was just telling me he's going to go to the
Well,
Thomas
you
Runner.
should look into it because you could maybe get a residency there.
Yeah, I should look at that.
You
But
should
anyway,
look at it. But, so he asked me yesterday, so we're doing this at Red Cat, which is right next to Disney Hall, a little black box theater, about 300 people, which, sold out with Werner literally in 2 minutes.
I bet.
2 minutes.
It's probably,
literally, I mean, gone. But it was the same thing at the Royal Festival Hall where there were 3,000 people gone. He just intrigues people forever. And he asked me, so how would you like the setup? And I said, I'm glad you asked. I want 2 chairs, 2 tables, and I want the chairs to face each other as much as possible without, being like this, but like this.
Open to the audience.
Because I want to look into the eyes of my opponent.
Opponent.
I didn't use the word opponent, of course. I don't believe he's an opponent, but I
says something interesting there. You guys do have a bit of a. It's not a sparring, but
we do have a sparring, and
there's something there. Competitive almost in a way.
Yeah,
even with just quotes and words and ideas.
Of course, yeah,
in a great way.
And I will use for him the wonderful line he has, which sounds like Hölderlin, but isn't. He says, "The poet must not avert his eyes."
Oh, that's great. Who says that? It sounds like him, though.
It's Hölderlin through Herzog, through Kurosawa. It's various people have said it.
Hölderlin, I love him.
But I think it's right. I think it's correct.
You've had these amazing conversations with Werner since I first met you, which, as I think we said before we came on, has been a long time. So you've been having these conversations with him regularly. He's not the only one. There's kind of, if we made a list of everyone you've talked to, it would sort of be a list of like the most influential people of the past decade or something, right? But how did you get there, Paul, from traveling around, hitchhiking, studying philosophy with Foucault? I mean, did you envision this path? Did you have a vision? What was the landscape?
I think, when I studied law and philosophy, I abandoned law very quickly. It wasn't cut out for it at all. Studied philosophy with all these fancy people. Because I was born in the United States, I have an American passport. I was born in Houston, Texas, where I spent 4 very important days, the memory of which is slight. We moved
4 days? Oh, I didn't know it was that short.
Days.
So your parents came from Mexico to Houston, had you, and then left.
Just had me because I had a medical condition, RH negative, blood condition, and they decided my father didn't trust the medical establishment in Mexico. He was right. Had me in America, had an American child, perhaps partly because he couldn't come into America during the war, which is another whole story. But then got back to America by having a child who is American. And then it became quite obvious that jobs in Europe teaching would probably not be many, with how impossible, let's say, in France it would have been. So off I went to do a comparative study of comparative literature departments, hitchhiked around the US to go to various universities, Princeton and Yale and Harvard and Penn and Michigan and God knows what, got into Princeton because of Foucault's letter, studied complet there, then taught at various fancy universities for a while. And I think by necessity, because I wasn't cut out either for the publish or perish. I think I rather perished than published.
You mean the whole academic, you have to publish
the whole
papers,
academic,
blah, blah, blah.
The politics of petty difference,
also the find your niche and stick to it. You can't hitchhike in the academic world.
You can't hitchhike, and again, my father said the more interests you have, the more interesting you are, and I think I developed kind of a rapacious appetite for many different things.
That doesn't fit well in academia in terms of...
It doesn't. Yeah. And, I never really managed to specialize in anything, even though I wrote about Walter Benjamin, and I did it because I had to in some way. And I've never been able, this coming week, I speak on Saturday was Werner, on Monday in New York at the Ford Foundation with Ruhr Benjamin, and the following week with Rebecca Solnit. 3 different worlds connected by the fact that I'm speaking to them. And it is true that I was a jolly good fellow at the Key, where I was supposed to write my dissertation into a book. Instead, I met Barbara and spent more time at the farmer's market buying fruit that I found and delivered to her, so much so that she thought that I was thinking she should begin making jam. And so then we got to know each other a little bit there, and then I started this adventure of speaking gigs at LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And 7 years after doing that and speaking to a lot of people there, the president of the library in New York called me up and came to LA to recruit me, which made Barbara very unhappy because she didn't want to go there already. And he said, I would like you to oxygenate the library.
That's a very important phrase from the New York years.
Yeah, and then I would say, you know, as you probably recall, I would always say before I brought somebody on stage, I would say my goal at the library is to make the lion, elevate.
The lions roar.
Roar, yes. Exactly. So I changed the oxygenate to roar.
But you also would like say you wanted it to float or levitate or something.
Float, right? To levitate, and when successful, to make it levitate. And so I started to talk with all these people, and 600 or 700 people later, I think if you do look at that list, and it's a list I need to make at some point, I never have, I think one would discover a lot of important voices.
That's for sure. I'll put a partial list somewhere or other for anyone who listens to this. But what's the through line is what I was trying to get at. What was it about being interested in philosophy and literature and then the conversation? I mean, you just kind of skipped that you started doing these conversations in LA, but obviously, like, what was it wasn't just fame. I think there might be something about you that's drawn to not necessarily fame, but people who are big.
I think there's something to do with fame, though. I'm worried about that. I always remember the wonderful line that Rainer Maria Rilke used in his book on Rodin. He said that fame was but the collection of misunderstandings that gather around a new name. And I think there's something about that which is true. I think there is something, if I have to be honest, that I'm impressed by when I get to, speak to Jay-Z or Mike Tyson or Laurie Anderson or Werner. But there's also something in me that is really interested in somehow unpacking people's thoughts and bringing them. I'm to be honest, I'm good at that in a way that most people are not good at it. By that, I mean to say, and it's very prepotente. I understand the boosterism and the fact that there's a lack of humility in my saying this, but what I know how to do, I think, when I do it well, when it works, it doesn't always work. There have been marvelous failures, but when it works, is create an atmosphere or a space where people feel at ease to bring out the multifaceted nature of human interest, and not just, writer writes book and pays penance by coming to the library to present book, but there's much more. There's much more to it. And
it becomes a sensory exploration or something. I mean, I really do.
I think so.
Yeah, I really do want to try to like think of it as a landscape that somehow you get people to move through together.
I love
or
this
link to their own trajectories.
The trajectory. It's hard to know exactly what led me to do what I'm doing. But I do think it's an ease with speech, though I have a speech impediment, which, you know, used to be stronger, but still is there. My lisp is still there.
That becomes part of the charm, is part of the charm, isn't it? That you turned what might have been a weakness into a strength, in a sense.
Maybe, but and I speak funny, you know. My younger son, who spent a lot of time, who now is at UCLA, so we went to the East Coast and he went to the West Side.
Oh, you have two sons?
I have two. My older son is unfortunately plagued by having gone through addiction, drug addiction. So
I know that. That's touched me too in my family. Oh yeah. Very hard. You just have to persist to try to open new paths and stuff.
But I don't know why we got onto the boys.
I think you were going to tell me something else about something your son said or said.
Oh, that I speak funny.
Yeah, the lisp thing.
He spent a lot of time during the pandemic at home and got to know me better and realized that I have an accent. He hadn't quite realized it as much. And he also realizes that I really mispronounce not only everything, but have strange tournure de phrase, you know, a strange way of putting words together.
But I think that's one thing that makes you really good at what you do too, at least from an outsider perspective, is that you have all this things that are familiar to many different people, but also many things that are unfamiliar, and all these different languages and countries, and there's all this movement, and also there's all these other emotional and philosophical and literary landscapes that you visited, and you can sort of mesh it all together and bring it close to whoever you're talking to. At least that was kind of the feeling I had in listening to your conversations and things, that somehow you'd had covered so much space that you could always link some interesting path to their path that they hadn't thought of before.
And, you know, the conversations that are successful is when a brother, father, mother, sister, a friend, a lover, a husband, and even more so the subject says, I said something I've never said before, or I made a connection. And I suppose what you're saying is true. For me, there's a folly of contiguity. There's a possibility of bringing together in a way which I have been unable to do on a page. I'm able to do it through speech.
And it really is like an exploration, getting to the edge of something. And then, I mean, isn't that what you like about reading too, in a way, is that it takes you somewhere to an edge or a different sensory place, a different mental place. It's all the same thing in a way. Conversation can do that even more powerful.
And I also think that conversation, particularly in our time now, it seems like I've chosen a profession, or at least I had a profession until recently. We can get into that in a moment. That is very much in need. In other words, I think it's not something that is done frequently. And partly my ability to do this is different from most ways in which this is done, because either it's done in an academic setting, which I'm sure you know very well, where you go and hear people giving papers, sometimes fabulously. I mean, my goodness, I've heard extraordinary lectures, no doubt about it. And I've heard some extremely good conversations, but usually there's something rather staid about them and a little bit stale about them. And I try to bring in everything I've got, which includes most importantly a kind of listening that makes people listen. And then another part that I try to bring up whenever I can is a level of humor. Humor is very important too. I've often said that I don't think I could ever love someone whose adjectives I wouldn't share, but I also think I couldn't love someone whose humor I didn't share.
This reminds me of Barbara again too. What was the question you asked her before you, like when you were thinking of getting married? And you have to remember it at some point. I remember you used to talk about there was this one question that
Oh, she had a question whether I liked Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Oh, was that it? Okay.
I think so. God, how?
But I think you had a question too. I think there was two questions. That sounds familiar.
But how
I have a very good memory. I studied memory, so I can remember the times we met. I just don't remember the last time we met. I seem to think maybe it was at Grand Central at that kind of cool Campbell room or something.
Yeah.
Maybe there.
Which doesn't exist anymore.
Doesn't? So we can date it to at least that, the closing of that.
So nice.
But I don't know if that was the last time. Surely it was in New York before you left. We haven't seen each other in California, so. And you haven't been here, or I haven't seen you here, and I've been living here, so.
And here for you is Berlin.
I live in Holland now, but I was in Berlin mostly.
Where do you live?
Utrecht?
I bicycled through much of Holland, all the way up to the Afsluitdijk.
Oh, wow. All the way up there to the islands? Did you take the ferries around? And
from Brussels? Yes, I did.
Wow.
I went over that bridge on the Afsluitdijk, and I went all around from Rotterdam to Amsterdam, all of that. I did by myself.
On a bicycle the whole way?
On a bicycle.
Oh,
well, I had a girlfriend in the south of France who was quite a bit older than I was, and I bicycled from Brussels all the way to Aix-en-Provence to see her.
That's very
crazy,
wonderful.
Romantic.
It's very romantic, yeah. See, that gets to something about you too, right? These big gestures that are really coming from the heart. There's that Thoreau quote I always thought about. I'm sure I told you before this, that reminds me of, or that you remind me of, the enthusiasm is a supernatural serenity. I think it's Thoreau. Yeah. Enthusiasm is a supernatural serenity. I'm pretty sure. But you have this, right? This overabundant energy. And when you kind of put it into what you're doing, yeah, something
Enthusiasm
happens.
is a supernatural serenity, because interesting, because of course Emerson, part of that whole group of people, said that nothing great was ever achieved without enthusiasm.
It's a great,
but I think meant it in the etymological sense of entheos, which literally means to be transported by the gods.
There you go, transport right there. It's this movement and transport, being transported.
Movement.
Do you feel like you need to, put your energy somewhere?
Well, when I interviewed Pico Aya once in Jamaica in a festival called Calabash, a wonderful festival where you're in front of 2,000 people on the beach and the backdrop is the ocean. I quoted this wonderful line from an essay by George Santayana in The Philosophy of Travel. He says that Aristotle talks about plants being firmly grounded in the soil, but man, Aristotle says, has the intelligence of locomotion.
Yeah,
so again, this idea of movement, this idea that I would probably talk to Werner about of traveling. You know, he doesn't like the notion of walking. He says, I travel on foot. Right? The notion of traveling on foot, which he shares with Chatwin, this whole notion of movement and of filmmaking as a kind of nearly a something you do with your body.
It's embodied.
Yeah.
Cognition is how we make our way through the world. Like that Santayana book is really interesting, right? I think plants are moving, but they're not moving in the same way. And it's really interesting to think of thought as locomotion. I would say literally that's kind of true. And so if you put that into context of something like, let's go to New York, right? That's where we met. So New York Public Library, when you were there, these events, this space, you said you wanted the building to levitate. And I remember walking in, they were often at night, just kind of after sunset, and you sort of you're walking into this amazing building on 42nd Street around sunset time. And then you walk in and there was a kind of sensory ambiance. I don't know how much you had to do with that, but there would always be music playing. The lights were in a certain way. It almost felt like you'd kind of come to a nice party with the lights and people mingling. The stage would be set up in a very particular way. And I mean, there was a kind of cognitive space being created there. a landscape that everyone was sort of participating in. It was participatory sense making or way making going on. I don't know how much of that was conscious, but when I think back on it, I remember that movement, and it all became part of the conversation in a way. Did you think about all that, or was it just you were just in the moment? Yeah.
No. It was very much prepared. Very, very. I mean, you picked up on all of it. The music was tremendously important to me. When it was the wrong music, I got very upset, and people who worked around me couldn't stand me. The light was very conscious. I was always upset by how cold the room was, so I always asked people to make it warmer. The images Werner was very, very instrumental in that. Actually, this time around, he doesn't want us to have any film clips because he wants me to talk about him as a writer and as a poet. So no images. We'll see. I've never done an event without images with Werner, so it'll be interesting to see how that works out. But no, that they were very much there to, when I had Christopher Hitchens, it was important for me to play a snippet of a lecture that Isaiah Berlin gave during his years at Hitchens took a class at Oxford, or to surprise Harold Bloom with Walt Whitman reading. And, this was also, it was a wonderful way also of creating, again, movement, creating something extraterritorial, as it were. But, and you use the word waymaking, which is, of course, a very interesting way of thinking of it as, a path, which seems to me really what I've tried to create, a path through words to a person. So you go from...
that's beautiful. Yeah.
It feels that way,
it does.
through our connection now.
But I wanted to ask you what it's like to listen, and because we talked about how you learned how to talk. We could say it's from your father in a way, from hitchhiking, maybe just also from you being who you are. But the listening part, is that more your mom's influence, or?
Well, it's interesting, my mother, when I was 11 years old, said to me, "Paulie, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth," probably because I wasn't listening, right? And as well, and so I've discovered, and this was through social media, somebody wrote to me and said, this line of your mother's is not your mother's. It goes all the way, and I can send it to you. It goes all the way back to the Greek. There's a long history of that. Listening for me is really, it's a form of attention. It's a bit like what Simone Weil talks about when she says that attention is a form of prayer. It's really, it's what we do when we really are with somebody, is pay attention, listen. It's so important to create that space where you just lean back. Actually, mostly I don't lean back, I lean forward. And I bring, I know I do this, and sometimes, people have wondered about it, and that some of it is conscious and some of it is unconscious. It's a mixture.
That you lean forward in your chair when you're talking to people.
And so it also creates a space where people, when you used to come to the Bartos Forum, the big one, there would be 500 or 600 people there. Wild.
It is wild. And that's interesting too about the listening, because you create that you listen in a certain way, that your listening changes the way the room listens in a way. Did you figure that out? I mean, was that part of...
I think that is again very, I become the medium or the midwife or I think that if it's really so interesting to listen to this, see an example of it on stage and do the same. And so people paid attention.
It changes the attention. That's what it does.
It does change, and it changes the focus.
Awareness. Yeah.
And I'm sure that some people also, I'm not sure, I know some people would sometimes think of themselves as a person who would be on stage in my place. A little bit like when you go and see an analyst, there's a form of projection. You would like to become the analyst, the person who listens.
Yeah, in that sense,
I rubbed some people the wrong way. Anyway, what were you going to say?
Well, no, that's exactly where I was going to go, because there's a dance, isn't there, between the listening. You're also kind of guiding, as you said, you're using words to create a path to someone, but you're also sort of opening this path with whatever. It was like 600 people, but sometimes you interrupt people. Or I remember maybe we had a conversation once about someone criticizing you for talking and not just letting the person talk. But I've noticed with really good interviewers that they do interrupt at key points. Have you ever thought about that?
I have, and I think there are two sides to it. There's one where I hold a silence for a very long time, and it really can become uncomfortable. Barbara, sometimes will say, that was a bit much.
Pause was too long or something?
Yeah, too long. Yeah. Sometimes the pause actually really brings about things that without the pause wouldn't come about at all. And sometimes I think the interruption can be of two kinds. One is interrupting the thought, where you interrupt and you break the person's thought pattern. The other one, which is of course more important and better, is the interruption that brings the person closer to a deeper understanding of what they were trying to do, or brings them back away from the digression upon the digression, back to maybe just the digression that brings them back to the point they were trying to make. Though, quite frankly, I don't believe too much in too many points. I believe more in the randomness of whatever it is that might happen. And I think Adam says that when we've had a really good conversation, we really don't know what we're talking about. We've lost the thread.
Did you give people kind of an outline of what you're going to talk about? Never. Okay.
Never, except politicians who always wanted it, but never. But I would do this thing where I would call the people I would be talking to or have an exchange. For instance, yesterday was Rua Benjamin, and we had a half-hour conversation yesterday where we touched upon things we might talk about. That's
good. Yeah.
And with Werner, I wrote to him, but he hasn't yet written back. I said, the future of truth, we're talking in the context of art in a times of crisis. Perhaps it might be interesting to think about the present moment and what's happening, some of the calamities that are happening around the world now. And particularly, I think the Middle East is important. The relationship Germany has to Israel is, of course, extremely complicated. I just give this as an indication, but what Werner and I will talk about, I don't know quite.
Do you ever get lost, Paul, to talk about the present moment a bit too? Where are you now?
All the time lost. Lost in what way do you mean?
In conversations that you're having with people, but also in a bigger picture. Do you ever get lost?
Yes.
Off the path you thought you were going to be on? Not digressing necessarily, but really, yeah.
Yes, I do. I've gotten lost also in knowing, how to find my way. And I get lost quite simply because I have no sense of direction.
Oh, yeah.
I have no sense of direction, none. In New York, which is a city where one wouldn't get lost very easily, Andrea would forcefully walk with absolute conviction in the wrong direction. Unless the GPS in my car tells me turn left and tells me exactly, I have no sense of where to go. So I get lost in many different ways.
And right now, where are you? That was the question too, in your life. And
well, in my life, I somehow do feel compelled to tell you. So I came out to LA, as you know, because of Barbara, in some ways. I say in some ways, not because she wasn't enough of a reason, but because I had been at the library for over 14 years, and that's twice a 7-year itch. And maybe it was time to put an end to that. It was magnificent there. If I had stayed on more, it was magnificent, but it wasn't, because the last few years were sort of getting old. It was great probably in the years when you came. The first 6 or 7 were filled with an incredible energy, one that I also had more of than I do now. Came out here. I'm on the board of a foundation called the Onassis Foundation, which is a Greek foundation founded by Aristotle Onassis. When his son died in a plane crash, he created this foundation for public benefit. And there's a cultural component of it in New York. There's a cultural component of it in Athens. And I said to the president of the foundation and his wife, Aphrodite, I said, we should create a part in LA. We transport goods from one port to another. Let's transport ideas to the Pacific Rim. They thought this was magnificent. I created something called Onassis LA, where I was going to do all kinds of cultural events. I did a few, and then the pandemic hit. And I created this daily podcast, which you can hear, called the Quarantine Tapes. And so 250 programs later, a little over a million people, over 1 million people listening. Everybody from Henry Rollins to Sonny Rollins to Myra Kalman to Pico Iyer to Werner to so many people. Blah, 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 lots of blah, blah, blah. Roseanne Cash, I'm forgetting all the people who I spoke to, but a lot of them. And then about a year ago, the president called me up and said, we're going back to the cradle of civilization. It was his word. So, Andrea, for the first time in my entire existence, I am jobless. And I don't know what I'm going to do next. I'm going to go and see a doctor now to make sure that I still get in on our health plan, which ends in 2 weeks. So you're catching me at an interesting moment. I'm speaking to a few people. I'm wondering whether to create something on my own. I don't think that's necessarily the wisest thing, because I don't think I'm disciplined enough to create my own outfit. I'm okay. I'm kind of confident that something will happen. I'm not a spring chicken anymore. I'm not a summer chicken. I'm kind of an early autumn chicken. I'm not young anymore. I'm not a Wunderkind anymore. I'm not a kind, and I'm less of a Wunder. And so this is a moment which is difficult. The hours between 2 and 4 in the morning are not great. But I keep the night company.
Company. There's the line. Yeah.
Remember that.
I remember that. Yeah.
God, you see, speaking to me today is like speaking to me back then.
I hope so, because I don't think it's the same, but there's definitely continuity, and you still have all those gifts, and you've been giving to a lot of people for a lot of years. In a way, that was what I was trying to get at by asking you if it's hard to hold the space. I guess you're entering a new space now.
I am entering a new, to use the word you so beautifully used, and which maybe is a way for me to think about it. So you've helped me also through this conversation, through a conversation we help each other, which is another, there's of course a therapeutic aspect to speaking, but there's also one of kindness and generosity, which is also has to do with space. And so not to lose the thread of the word that you used, which maybe is what I need to look at now, is it's a new landscape.
Yeah.
And I don't know where geographically speaking, I think it needs to remain LA at least for a while, because of our older son, because of Oliver being at at UCLA, we might as well benefit from the fact that he's close by. But there's a mortgage to be paid, and there are financial considerations which are sort of devastating.
Yeah.
And because also cost us so much,
I know
hundreds
what you mean.
I mean, just
it's crazy. I know.
Just all of our savings disappeared.
Yeah.
I mean, all. So
you have to do something. A new
Yeah.
landscape is there. Maybe you have to learn how to read maps. I mean that more metaphorically, but
No, I understand.
we've been talking about, I mean, you have this richness, right, of paths, and you've opened up paths for so many other people, and maybe there's some way you can get a little bit of a view of yourself and where all these paths that you've opened might already be leading somewhere or other. There's definitely a perspective there that no one else has. So I think the question is, how do you best in this day and age communicate it? I don't know what the answer is, but I'm sure the people around you know.
And by the way, in this day and age is really an important part of what you're saying, because it's probably a little bit different in Europe than it is in the US. But, there's a reckoning happening here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm white. I'm older. Now, on top of it all, I'm Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
Where do I fit?
Mm-hmm.
The problem of fitting has always been a problem for me anyway, but now there's that added not fitting, and people are coming not to the rescue, because we can't be rescued, but for instance, on Sunday, nobody knows this except for Barbara and now you. So you have a way too, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
On Sunday, just before I go to New York, a group of people are going to have a phone call with me on Zoom to see how they can help me.
Wonderful.
So
yeah.
people are thinking, we can't leave this man jobless.
Maybe it goes back to the thing we talked about at the beginning too, about it's hard to have friends and friendships, and it's scary to go deep and be vulnerable and this kind of thing. I mean, maybe that's the landscape that you're entering now, and maybe that's the place that all this stuff that I think of that backpack and Bruce Chatwin and this kind of, I don't know where all that comes in, but talking about landscapes, you've got this backpack full of stuff. You've been on all these explorations. Maybe now it's the time to open up your conception of who you are and see what other people see, and maybe be vulnerable a little bit. Maybe that's the lesson. That's what this is in a way. You don't have to hold the space. Somebody can help you create it.
You know who owns Bruce Chatwin's backpack?
I think I saw it in a movie or something with Herzog, right?
Werner actually has in his home.
Yeah.
He has tattoo, and he brought it once on stage when I think he brought it to Barcelona where we spoke, but I'm not sure now. And he has it, and Bruce Chatwin was so sick, and Chatwin and Werner went to visit him, and Bruce said to him, I want to put on my backpack. And I mean, he weighed 80,
like in delirium or something.
He weighed 80 pounds. He was dying.
Oh gosh.
It's in his movie about Chatwin.
Yeah, that must be what came to mind.
Yeah, that's where you saw it. And he actually said to Werner as he was dying, "Take my backpack." So it's so interesting. You should bring this up.
That's very strong, because that's what it is. Yeah, maybe you need to give your backpack to someone. You're just beginning. You're still pretty young, Paul. And yes, you have all this. I mean, you're not young, but you're not old. So there's a lot of years left to give.
When do you think I was born? I'm turning the age of a song of the Beatles.
The one about, will you still
love me? Will you take care of
me when
will you need me when I'm 64?
64. Oh my gosh, that seems so old when I was a kid.
It seems so old, and I'm that age.
But there's something wonderful about it. I mean, you've been alive, you've experienced life, and We need that right now. We need people who've fully experienced
Funny you
life.
should say this, because I got a message the other day from this doctor who's the head of neurology and palliative care at Cedars-Sinai. He wrote me a message, kind of a fan letter, saying that he's been following what I'm doing and would love to create a series with me on the notion of care. What does it mean to care? And we've
that's
been
beautiful.
Beautiful. We've been
Learning
having
to care.
Yeah, we've been having these exchanges, and I've met a few people through him, and we've had these dinners. And recently I told him how worried I am, financially. And he said, you will find a job. Just continue to do what you're doing, which is to live fully. You have such a rich life.
That's
It was
true.
so interesting. But of course, there are also practical issues I have to address.
Well, I think this is the artist, the reason, emotion, passion, artist. This is the hard thing. This knowing life is so full and feeling it in full and going with it. And then also there is a practical side, that we have to deal with. And yes, there is a flow. You can get into that space where you're surfing both of those things. I think part of it is this, like, working with it, right? This is how we find new landscapes and create new paths, and it's not like comfortable. But when you were just talking, I had this kind of vision of participatory environment, like I was describing with the New York Public Library.
It's very, you were talking about it, the sensuous feeling you had getting in, the threshold you passed when you got your ticket and you walked in, and sometimes you would even have drinks, and there was something happening there, and the whole feeling of it, and choosing your seat and the person next to you. And there were a lot of things that that happened in that space. And for me, yes, there is also the fact, and Barbara talks about this all the time. She always says, you need to go back to an audience. The podcast was good, but an audience is better. Being on stage is better. It's better, yeah. And I love it, and I feed off it.
I think that's why it's better, because you're different than you really have to listen to yourself, and living in full, it's not about what everyone else thinks is cool right now or what everyone else wants. You're unique. You have all these different ways of seeing the world, and part of the charm is the kind of thing that might be peculiar in the world. It's just the peculiarity that isn't peculiar to you, And part of that, I do think, I remember those moments of the room being alive, and I don't think you need to try to create that, but see where the environment is where that's created for you. I think there's a grace to it. It's just who's going to open that space, or where is that space? It already exists somewhere, I'm sure, and we need it. We've had too much Instagram.
We want it, and we need it, and we have to find it.
We do need it.
And to find a charged space. The other day, I'm doing this series with Occidental College, which is a college out here in LA, which is well known because Obama went there, but it isn't well known. And they have hired me to do these various things. So there was the first event, and now there's Rua Benjamin in New York, and then there's Rebecca.
So you're working, you're not jobless.
I'm doing these little things, right? But I launched this series with someone called Alok, who is a they, trans, non-binary. It was fabulous. And the non-binary way of thinking about the world is really interesting. And we need non-binary ways of thinking about the world.
We need some non-binary media or conversations.
Will we set another time to talk?
Yeah.
I just feel like we need to talk again, because not only have I enjoyed it, but I think it's I thank you for it.
Yeah, and I thank you. It's very helpful for me. So I would love to talk to you.
But I feel like Groucho Marx again. No, thank you.
No, thank you. No.
Thank you. You remember that? No, it's actually helpful. I feel this goes back to listening. It's something that they say in America, right? I feel heard, right? It's something that is said. So, and it's not something that often happens. I think I'm more And it has to do with pleasure also. You know,
That's a good word too.
Yeah, it's a very good word. It's about, giving and getting and sharing, and what the balance is there.
Yeah. It's
So
equilibrium.
yeah, equilibrium, or Adam doesn't believe in balance. And I understand that, being off balance. And I think that goes back to your beautiful line of peculiarity and following your inner demon, and following what matters to you, not what everybody else is telling you.
Yeah. If you can get clear, that's the path.
And anything that you feel, I love homework. So things you think I might read, or if you have thoughts about my future glorious life, let me know.
You could speak a book. You could just speak a book into your phone about your father, or
I'll tell you
your
one thing
life, or I don't know,
I'll tell you
all
one
these
thing that came
conversations.
to my mind. So many people have told me about writing a book. I've had famous agents wanting to be my
I'm sure,
agent,
but
and I've
maybe you
never
could
done
speak
it.
a book.
And I think I should speak a book.
Yeah.
And I had the thought, in speaking with you, that I should be speaking to you for the book. Just think about that.
Could do a little chapter by chapter conversations.
Because you ask very good questions. And I also want to you about waymaking. I'm just interested by it. If you have things about it, maybe you can give me a general idea when you send me the links. I feel there's something there that is close to what I've been thinking. I mean, the fact that I caught on that word, you just said it once, and that's another thing, right? Is in conversations. So somebody says something, and through conversation, finding a word. Do you know Alva Noé? I know Alva because he came to interview William Forsythe, and he stayed in touch you see, this is another thing.
Yeah, it's fair. I just looked at his book again because he came to a conference in Heidelberg and I just missed him, and I thought, oh, his stuff is probably interesting to look at.
It probably is, and this is what happens, and it's a way we were talking about. It's
exactly. There's all these connections
filled with references, and sometimes they make sense. And I
do.
don't know things. I don't know things. I'm so far from being an expert.
Nobody's an expert. I mean, that's not the point.
And Adam has a very interesting book about experts and the short-sightedness of it all. The only time I want an expert is if I'm ill and I want somebody to take care of something.
Exactly.
Then you need an expert. You don't need them to know Heidegger. You don't. A huge hug to you.
Yeah, a big hug to you too.
What a pleasure. Amazing.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, it was wonderful. Bye.